Hello, I'm Mike, the crafty physicist, and today I'm going to give a brief overview of a PhD in physics in the UK. In my last video I talked about a UK physics degree. I wanted to discuss my experiences, and to do that I needed a video explaining the basic workings of the degree so that I could point people to it as needed. I'm going now to do the same thing for a PhD in physics, a brief outline of what goes on in one, so that I can point people to it if I need to. From where I am going through one at the moment, I may not have the insight of someone who has finished theirs, and I don't want to give much advice for it since I might crash, burn and fail. But I should at least be able to give you an idea of what will happen during one. I'll set the time constraints on this based on someone doing their PhD full time. Part-time PhD students do similar things. You're still doing a PhD in the same sort of way, but it's generally spread over a longer period because you're doing it part-time. Also, as the title says, I'm talking about the UK here. There are different timescales and different expectations in other countries. So generally, after completing a master's course, either integrated master's at university or a 4-year degree, one of the options you'll have is to do a PhD. Usually the requirement for a PhD is that you have done a master's. The way it works to get onto a PhD is usually something like this. An experienced academic will be something called a supervisor. They will set up a project and ask for students to come to do it. The university or other organisation or laboratory will be able to fund a particular number of students to do a PhD. PhD students apply and pick the project out of the choice of all the supervisors and all the projects that they want to do. The university will then use interviews and grades and anything else they can to sort students into projects based on the funding they have. I'll talk about the funding options in more detail in another video. Students then work on this project. Generally the project is going to be very open-ended. If the answer was obvious, the supervisor would have done it themselves in an afternoon. And generally you have a time frame of roughly 3.5 years, although there are some ways to extend that. You do your work and you're expected to produce a piece of original research which expands the frontiers of knowledge in some way in your field. You are then examined based on this. In the UK, an examination generally consists of two things: a thesis and a viva. A thesis is a document which covers the scientific literature surrounding the work, what has been done in the degree, and the scientific results obtained, as well as perhaps a conclusion based on the importance of those results. A thesis is usually the size of a reasonable book, so say a couple of 100 pages, although some are longer and some are shorter. They will be read and judged by a panel of scientists who are deemed to have an expertise in that area of physics. Not all of them will be from your university. They go through your thesis with a fine-toothed comb. They look for every mistake, and they look for areas where you may have failed or your data may not be as good as you say it is. And then they get ready to grill you in an interview. This interview is the second part, the viva. These scientists who have looked through the thesis that you wrote will now ask you questions about it. They'll ask quite a few questions, and these interviews are multiple hours long, where you have to understand your work and how it fits into the science around it. Once this is done, they will give their verdict. Generally, this comes down to 4 options. Firstly, sometimes you pass with no need to correct anything. That's it, you've got your PhD. This is very rare. Secondly, they can give you minor corrections. This means you've basically got to go back and do some more work on your thesis, but you will get a PhD. So, minor corrections, as the name suggests, are minor. They could be things like just typos, or poor formatting perhaps. Or perhaps they want a few more citations in some points, but generally the corrections shouldn't take too long. They can then say you need to make major corrections. Something bigger is wrong. You've worked well and you'll probably get your PhD. as long as you do these corrections, obviously. But the extra work you're going to have to put in is more. This could be rewriting a sizable chunk of your thesis, or it could be adding some more experimental data on. With these two, there's generally a bit of back and forth between you and the people issuing the corrections to get, in the end, a thesis which is of an acceptable standard. If you don't get this, there is always fail. Do not pass go, do not collect your PhD, you've just completely failed. Sometimes what they'll do is downgrade you to a qualification called an MPhil, or a similar master's-based qualification. Basically that's you've done good work, but it's not at the standard of a PhD. If it's really bad, and they think there's no hope of you making any reasonable quality work in a reasonable time frame, they will just fail you. This is very rare, but it can happen. You can go through your thesis and your viva and they say, no, we're not going to give you anything. Go. So that's a brief overview of the PhD in general. I should note that there are also likely going to be examinations that your individual institution does. Perhaps they'll make you write a report at the end of your first or second year to check your progress. Basically, they don't want it so that you only realise you're failing. They only realise that you're failing right at the end when you're about to hand in your thesis. So they will likely get you to write something like that up. And also, of course, your supervisor will hopefully be in some form of contact with you. And they will work out whether you are failing or whether you are doing what they expect as a reasonable standard of work. There's also writing in scientific journals. This is not actually a requirement. Your PhD is based on your thesis and your viva. However, certainly if you want to go into research afterwards, you are very likely going to need to have put some output in academic journals. It's also quite a good thing because while theses are useful in that purpose, they're a long old book. Scientific journals tend to get read a lot more often than PhD theses, so if you want your work spread out over the scientific community, it's something that you're probably going to want to do. I've also not mentioned any teaching or anything like that because that's generally not included in UK PhD. One of the reasons I said about doing this in 3.5 years is because it's very focused on getting the research done. I know there's a lot of countries which have 5 or 6 or even more year PhDs as standard because you do a lot of teaching as part of your life as a PhD student. That's generally not so in the UK. So there you go. That's about all I have to talk about. I can't talk about the work involved in a PhD thesis because it is so varied now. And while I could talk a bit about supervisor and student relationships and how that gets managed in an institution, that I think is a video on its own that I'm in no way qualified yet to make. So there you go. The way I see it, that's the basics of a UK PhD in physics. I've been Mike, the Crafty Physicist. Good night.